it's not Dr. Bob's birthday, but the celebration being in his honor, we baked him a cake. And if I can get hold, here it is. And for the benefit of you people who are not close enough to observe the results of the imagination of our friends at the bakery, which is considerable, but with considerable help from various friends of Bob Jones, at least I think up to the moment they have been his friends, we have some interesting symbols on this cake, and we are asking Ron Wright, the distinguished TV guest of ours here for the rally, to tell you a little bit about what is on the cake. Mr. Ron Wright.
Last Monday I was a speaker. Tonight I'm a cake reader. How about that? You know, it's not very commonly known, but Dr. Bob was a baby. The little baby on the cake will remind you that Dr. Bob was born October 19th, 1911, in Montgomery, Alabama, to Evangelist and Mrs. Bob Jones. And the small Bible you see on the cake will remind you also, and remind Dr. Bob, that this was the book that would be the book that would give his life meaning, because it talked of God and salvation through Christ. And it was at the age of 6 that Dr. Bob accepted our Savior Jesus. Now, the Santa Claus you see on the cake is a unique little thing, because during the period when young Dr. Bob was just a little shaver and just preceding his 3rd Christmas, little Bob sent his Christmas list to Santa Claus. A few days later, his father came home with an answer from a jolly old elf with some stipulations for the young man. Dr. Jones came in, and Mrs. Jones, her mother, and young Bob were sitting down for dinner. "I've just got a letter from Santa Claus," he announced, and Bob fairly jumped off his chair, clapping his hands with glee. It says, "Dear Dr. Jones, I understand you have a little boy named Bob. Bob Jones, is that right?" And Bob nodded his head real furiously, and he said, all smiles, and leaned forward to hear for the next sentence. "Well, there are some things," Santa said, "I want to be perfectly sure about before I can bring the toys your son asked for this Christmas." And his father continued very deliberately. He read from Santa Claus's letter, "I'm sure that Bob never has to be told more than once to put his toys away." And the little boy's smile began to fade. "And I'm sure, too, that he always plays nicely and is never selfish when playing with his playmates," he read on. Bob's head bent lower and lower, and his spirit began to wilt under the heavy requirements. "And I just know," the imaginary Santa Claus letter said, finally, "that your Bob always obeys his mother and his father and his grandmother quickly and without any fussing." Full of despair and defeat, the little boy slumped back dejectedly in his chair. And then, as if a ray of hope had suddenly come through, he perked up his chair, raised up his chubby arm, and in his most earnest voice said, "Tell him I've quit him." And then the little train you see on the cake is the train that Bob rode when his mother and dad went to preach the gospel. And as is always the case when the family traveled a great deal with Dr. Jones, who had evangelistic meetings all over the country, discipline was not always an easy matter for young Bob. Mrs. Jones determined that it would be maintained in the little boy's life. Before each trip with his evangelist father and his mother, it was a small ritual that Bob, from the time he was a toddler, went out with Emma, his nurse, and helped her select from the peach tree a keen switch about 2 feet long, which was packed in an easily accessible bag and used to keep the little traveler within the bounds of socially acceptable behavior. Now, it was a much respected implement because of the tingle it left when attached to the legs. Now, on the train to New York, 3-year-old Bob had made friends with a lovely lady across the aisle. And as they conversed back and forth, he tired of sitting in the seat, and standing in the aisle, he put one hand on his armrest and one hand on the lady's arm, and began to swing himself back and forth, as little boys like to do. Still talking to his friend and perhaps wondering how long his newfound freedom would last, he nodded toward a little black carry-on bag of his mother's and confided, "Do you know what's in that bag?" "Why, no," she screamed, wide-eyed with make-believe wonder. "What is in that bag?" "A fitch," he responded knowingly, and climbed back into the train to rest again. Well, the football, you see, was to prove young Dr. Bob's strength. But there was something else, too, because his father wanted to make sure that young Dr. Bob knew how to take care of himself. So life in Montgomery was the same as life everywhere for 8 to 12-year-olds as Bob grew up. In his childhood, young Bob was a combination mystic and mischief. Several times he came home the loser in a neighborhood tiff. And the elder Bob Jones determined to remedy that state of affairs. He engaged a strapping young amateur boxer to work out with Bob every day to be sure he could defend himself should the need arise. And at the end of several weeks, the coach reported to the father that his young trainee was ready to defend himself against all comers, confident that his son could take care of himself in any future fracas. Now, Dr. Jones was at ease, not worrying about his being overcome in any emergency. Young Bob, however, couldn't wait to prove his new prowess to his playmates. Systematically, he invited each one over, proposed a fight, and proceeded to knock each one down. Thereafter, the fight question was settled. And I think, if you'll notice the small little dog near the top of the cake, that was Mexie, and this was Dr. Bob's dog. And every boy needs a dog, they say, and Bob Jones Jr. was no exception. One of his first pets was Mexie, a tiny white dog the Joneses found cowering beside a lonely road near Mexico. They stopped to see about the abandoned puppy, and Bob prevailed on his parents to let him keep it for his own. Not knowing how it could possibly work out satisfactorily, Mrs. Jones lined the hotel bathroom's tile floor with newspapers and left Bob to care for his tiny charge while the evangelist and his wife went to the meeting that night. When they returned, they found Bob sound asleep on a big pillow in his bed with Mexie alongside him and a note on the nightstand saying, "Dear Mom, Mexie has behaved very well." Mexie won their hearts and came home with them in a makeshift carrier made from a bird cage. And through the years, he became so aware of a family custom that when he saw them get out their suitcases, he hovered around attentively and sadly, knowing they were going away. Now, Mexie was the family pet until he was killed in an accident while young Bob was on his first trip abroad at the age of 12. And the dog Bob loved, the foundling puppy he found on the roadside in Mexico, or near Mexico, and lived and loved with Bob until he was killed and went to wherever God sends his animal creatures. Now, the painting you see on the cake is something that is probably the dearest thing in our Dr. Bob's life, because at an early age, he was bent to find out about culture. Even in his preteen years, the cultural bent of his life, so observable in Bob Jones University, could easily be seen. And it was on his first trip to Europe and the Holy Land during his 12th summer that Bob Jones first showed his interest in works of Renaissance art. He lingered over the paintings in the old churches of Italy, particularly Naples and Venice, and studied every detail. And when his birthday came that fall, Bob said, "Dad, I saw a book about cathedrals that I know is very expensive, but that is all I really want for my birthday." His mother recalls that her son's lessons suffered that fall and winter as he spent every spare minute after classes poring over the pages of his precious art books. In those days, no doubt were the seeds of inspiration sown for Bob Jones's university collection of sacred art, which now draws visitors from throughout the world to its magnificent galleries in Glenville, South Carolina. And he learned that art and that love of painting and culture at the knee of his beloved grandmother, Mrs. Estelle Siddons Stolenwerk. By 1938, Dr. Jones had been acting president of Bob Jones College for 6 years, had already received an honorary Doctor of Letters degree, and was very eligible, a very eligible 27-year-old. And if you will take just a small moment to look at the wedding dress on the cake, you will find the symbol of the lovely lady he married. Fannie Mae Holmes and Bob Jones were in the first 4-year graduating class from Bob Jones's college. While he pursued his educational endeavors, she took advanced work at the Colorado State College of Education. Her major project, experimenting with angel food cake recipes, not only fulfilled a requirement for her degree, but also equipped her to return to Bob Jones College to teach and cinch her love affair with Bob by the practical application of recipes. Through the years, Dr. Jones has jokingly told his friends, "Fanny got me to marry her on an angel food cake." Well, let's go back just a little bit. When Bob was just 11, if you'll look at the school things you'll see on the cake, he went to Stark Military Academy in Montgomery, Alabama, and then just before his 16th birthday transferred to Bob Jones Academy. And the diploma you see, Bob received from Bob Jones College then, and it was the Bachelor of Arts. And before he was 21, he went to the University of Pittsburgh and earned his Master of Arts degree. And after that, following years of study, he had gone to the University of Chicago, the University of Alabama, Northwestern University, where he learned much in those days, and not the kind of things you learn today in the colleges on our land. Now, the old Model T that you see on the cake, Bob learned quickly that cars were here to stay, and now probably with all the traffic congestion we have in the land, he wishes he had it back. Now, the small child you see on the cake is the symbol of young Bob III. And you know, at the time they were expecting their first child, Dr. and Mrs. Jones, well, Dr. Jones had made it known over and over again that he was expecting God to give him a son to help run the school entrusted to him. Now, Bob, you know that God might see fit to send you a daughter, his mother would point out, not wanting him to get his hopes too high. However, all efforts to get him to be open-minded about the coming event failed. And when it was announced to him that Bob Jones III had arrived, no new father could have been more triumphant. Proud grandparents, relieved that their son had not been disappointed, came to look over the little baby who was destined to carry on the leadership of the world's most unusual university. Only hours old, he was extremely wrinkled. Looking at his furrowed little brow and his tiny pinched face, one of them, amused, remarked, "It looks as though Bob Jones III knows already that he has had the burdens and responsibilities of the school placed on his shoulders." There is a scroll on the cake which would indicate some of the Shakespearean accomplishments of Dr. Bob Jones. And the great bard of Avon found a new champion in Bob when he portrayed all of the great Shakespearean characters. And just recently, this year, Bob Jones III and his father, Dr. Bob Jones, played Iago and Othello, respectively. And it's probably the first time, and as far as I can tell, no one has ever heard in the history of the theater, or amateur, professional, or otherwise, that a father and son ever played these two roles together in a Shakespearean play. So that's a first for our Dr. Bob and a first for the world. Now, the suitcase you see on the cake became almost a part of young Dr. Bob Jones as he traveled the highways and byways telling the good news that Christ would come again. And the plane that Bob always flies in to preach God's word, and he never has to worry about crashing. Never has to worry about that. Even though the scriptures do say, "Lo, I am with you always." Dr. Bob knows the Lord is with him high in the sky, too. And the trumpet player you see on the cake denotes something I think of most importance. Because of the things going on in America today, that trumpet player denotes the one particular thing that Dr. Bob won't allow on his campus: rock and roll music. Now, on top of the cake and in front, I believe you can see a picture. Is the picture there? Or has it been moved? Well, that picture, if I can recall what it said, is the Founders Memorial Amphitheater. And it is being built and is going to be dedicated all of the Thanksgiving week this year, and we hope to see everyone there. It will hold 7,500 people. And I can't think of any better way to do this and to close this little soliloquy of not nonsense, but tender love for Dr. Bob Jones, for us all to stand and say, "Dr. Bob Jones, this is your life."